Thank you. Good evening and welcome to our fifth zoning bylaw information session. For those who have not joined us before or just tuning in, my name is Heather Monroe. I am the town administrator. This evening we'll be covering the MBTA zoning bylaw that is proposed. Before we begin, just a little bit of background as we have every evening in the event someone's joining us for the first time. In 2023, we organized the zoning bylaw steering group to guide the revision of our zoning bylaws using funds from a state earmark. With the steering group's support, we hired CMRPC, Central Massachusetts Regional Planning Commission, to assist in this important effort. The core group consists of representatives from CMRPC, Neil Bagdis, the chair of the planning board, Roberta Bryan, chair of Zoning Board of Appeals, Cheryl Lombardi, town service coordinator, and myself as town administrator. We've also received valuable insights from our other town leaders, including Fire Chief Mike Pingatori, DPW Director Travis Thibault, Building Commissioner Dave Carl, Paxton Municipal Light Plant, 7 p.m. As we stated at last week's meeting, if you have any comments, questions, or feedback you'd like to provide, please send it in. You can send it over to me, and I will get it to all of those involved at hmonroe, M-U-N-R-O-E, at townofpaxton.net, hmonroe, M-U-N-R-O-E, at townofpaxton.net. Once these final amended versions are approved by the planning board, again on October 29th at 7 p.m., they'll be incorporated into the town meeting warrant articles for consideration at the special town meeting on November 18th. So for this evening, Jane is with us on Zoom, but in the audience tonight, we actually have Gabe with us from CMRPC. Just give us 1 second, technical difficulties. Thank you. So Gabe will be with us from CMRPC, and he'll be walking us through the MBTA zoning bylaws, both what the actual requirement is from the state, what the steering group's process has been in developing the bylaw, and what the content of the bylaw is. All right, Gabe?
2020, I think early 2021, the state legislature passed the MBTA communities zoning law. It's a change to Mass General Law, Chapter 40A, Section 3A, that basically identifies a number of communities as MBTA communities, and using that identification tells them that they have to allow a certain amount of multifamily housing by right, within certain confines depending on the characteristics of the community. So the name MBTA, I think it has led to a couple of misconceptions. The bylaw that we've been tasked with writing by the state has very little to do with transit. The state was using transit as a way to identify the communities that they felt would be best served by new multifamily housing. So basically, Paxton is identified as an adjacent small town. So Paxton is adjacent to the city of Worcester.
A lot of communities have been tasked with putting this MBTA zoning bylaw in place. Mm-hmm. Gabe, can you just remind us when this bylaw has to be in place in order to be compliant?
Yes. So Paxton, like I said, is sort of at the lowest level of requirements of any of the communities. And I believe it's by the end of 2025 that Paxton would need to be in compliance. So if you were to pass this at fall town meeting, it would have to go to the state, and it would be a multi-month process for the state to approve the bylaw. Let's say the state does not approve the bylaw, passing it at fall town meeting, you'd probably hear in time for next fall town meeting, maybe next spring town meeting. So this would give the town some wiggle room to adjust the bylaw in line with what the state wants.
Okay, and then there's also always the possibility, and we've talked about this quite a bit amongst ourselves, that, there's always a possibility that bylaw does not pass at town meeting. So this also gives us the opportunity, for some reason, if that were to happen, that we're able to make any adjustments, more education, more information,
Right.
and put it back on the next meeting
Right.
to make sure we stay on target for having something approved by the end of December of 2025.
Yep.
Okay, so we have the basics down of that piece. So we talked a little bit about what the requirements were under, Section 3A of the housing under 40. Can you just kind of give us a rundown of the history or new?
Yeah,
It is actually
much of the bylaw is derived. The state provided municipalities. It's not a requirement that you use this, but they provided municipalities with a sample bylaw that I think in the state's mind would address any of the the majority of the concerns that a community might have, and especially for communities that don't have a history of multifamily housing. It identifies a number of building code standards for multifamily housing, things along those lines that towns that were being subject to this bylaw might not have had to address in the past. So to Heather's point, I think if you want to pull up the map so we can talk about the 3 proposed districts. So again, Paxton has a degree of flexibility in how it implements the MBTA zoning districts. We have in communities that have a transit station, there's a requirement that these districts be put within a certain distance of the transit station to encourage people to, walk or bike or take a bus to the train station, reduce car use, that sort of thing. In a town like Paxton, there's no train station, so there's not really a requirement from where physically to locate the districts, but we felt it would make the most sense to put these districts towards the eastern side of Paxton along Route 122. Just because that puts you in a decent proximity to, WRTA bus lines out of Worcester. That's sort of keeping in the spirit of the bylaw, and I think it also suits the development patterns in Paxton. So I think we had multiple discussions with the group, and at the end of the day, we identified 3 district locations. So for Paxton, there's no. Some of the other communities have acreage requirements for these districts. Paxton does not have, and has concerns with sewer and septic systems. So picking parcels of these size will give potential developers flexibility to install the sort of septic systems that are needed in Paxton.
Just a point as we continue here. There is no preference. There's not a 1, 2, and 3 or an A, B, and C. Those are just 3 parcels that have been deemed usable for the purpose of compliance with this bylaw.
Right.
Okay.
So a little bit more on that, Gabe. Can you just elaborate, when we're looking at these parcels and when the state was having, municipalities look at these parcels, what sort of requirements do they need to meet?
So, basically the state doesn't want to see towns, and, I've worked with a number of towns on these proposals, and we have, the towns I have worked with have not really been trying to, get one over on the state, but they don't want to see this land being zoned on. So certain land is excluded. That's a key thing. Institutional land and municipally owned land, or, if you had land that was like part of a state park or something, the state would not consider that a valid part of the overlay district and would not consider it when they consider, whether or not this contributes to your requirements. They want to see that the zoning bylaw has the capacity to allow, a certain amount of land that will allow a certain amount of multifamily density by right. And like Heather said, the actual development process would completely require the private landowner to either sell their land or work out a deal with the developer or something along those lines. And the state, the purpose of this bylaw was to encourage the development of more multifamily housing in the state. The state is in a housing crisis, and there's, limited options in a lot of towns. But for the purposes of compliance with the law and the legal consequences of not complying with the law, the state, for all purposes, does not, they're not looking at whether something gets built in the next, 5 years or anything like that. It's solely about the town showing that they're allowing this development capacity.
So,
Dave, I think it would be helpful for those not as familiar with planning terms or zoning, for you to go over the definition of an overlay and relate it to the other overlay districts that we have already in Paxton and sort of how those operate.
Right. So, just for some background, actually, do you want to could you pull up the zoning map? It's okay.
I don't know if I have access to that.
That's okay.
Jane, I'm sure you're listening to me. If you're are you able to pull up the zoning map on your computer?
I was gonna send it to you if I can.
Oh, sure thing.
Yeah. So yellow, red, green, that sort of thing. On top of that, what we have as a tool is what's called an overlay district, where usually these are used for very specific uses. So most towns in central Massachusetts have, if they have an aquifer that they want to protect, they have an aquifer protection overlay district where, for example, you would not be allowed to dump certain chemicals, or you would prevent certain uses, industrial uses, so you're not polluting the groundwater. And that can be applied to a bunch, any sort of use you want, you can create what's called an overlay district. So for MBTA, we're creating an overlay district where the sole purpose of the overlay district is to allow multifamily use by right. The overlay district does not override the underlying zoning, except in the specific case of what it's trying to allow or disallow, be that the case. So let's say, again, for example, a landowner wanted to develop this land. They would not be precluded from building single-family housing or whatever the other underlying uses in that particular district were. This overlay district just gives them the extra ability to develop, up to a certain density that we've prescribed.
I think the wireless district is a good example, too, in that the town has decided the best locations or areas for wireless, but it does not require a property owner to sell its property.
Right.
Or lease its property to a wireless communication.
Right, exactly.
To put a tower up. They have the ability to do it, they have the right to do it, but they do not have the obligation to do it. And I think that's very, very important to know that.
From the state's perspective, they don't want to see they don't want to see dangerous multifamily housing built. They want to make sure that the sewage, they don't need sewage backing up in the new multifamily housing built under their law. They don't want, unsafe buildings. All of the same laws about building code, and, wastewater and stormwater and those sorts of things all still apply. It's just the process will be simpler to encourage this sort of development.
So, Gabe, one of the questions we get a lot, and there's a lot of news right now. There was the one community, was it Milton? Right. Who's been back and forth with the state and court and so forth over adamantly refusing to comply. There's discussion of Holden making public statements that they're not going to comply. And one of the questions we got a couple times over the past couple days has been, what happens if a community fails to comply with the MBTA zoning requirements when they're in one of these locations? Are you able to summarize what our best understanding is?
Yeah. And again, for specifics, I would always like to defer to town council. But in short, the town would be in a pretty poor position in terms of their relationship to access to certain state grants. I think the one that often comes up is MassWorks. I do know that
which programs would actually be impacted. They do refer us to, there's a link online, I did send it to someone earlier today, 3A guidelines. So they talk a little bit in one section, determinations of compliance. So this has to do, these ones here are discretionary grant programs, where they say they'll take compliance with Section 3A into consideration when making grant award recommendations. So, based on the hard line that the state seems to be taking, that would suggest to many of us that if you're not in compliance, or at least trying to be in compliance, that you're not going to be eligible for these grants. But these ones are, similar. You have Rural Small Town Development Fund. You have here, there's about 13 of them. Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Planning and Project Grants, so that would go back to us working with the MS4 permits, stormwater and so forth, hazard mitigation plan. Also here they have local acquisitions for land grants and land use planning grants from EOEA. We're about to put in for about $20,000 grant for our Open Space and Recreation Planning Commission. or committee. So right now, we're probably okay in that first phase because right now we're still in compliance. But if we needed a further step or we wanted to take a step on that plan or what have you, we wouldn't be eligible. That's the compliance one. I thought they
think-
would.
Audience that's here tonight and going to watch this in the coming days, the grant that you got to do this project we're involved with right now would be something that may not have come through, correct?
Well, it's a state earmark, so the state legislature and the governor could say, we're not providing funding to communities who are not in compliance.
Okay, so that's one, and just
And this
roughly
isn't
what
the
was?
only, this isn't the only earmark.
No,
just
no,
to be
I
clear.
understand.
We
So
had-
I'm just trying to get people to understand what is at stake here. So the grant that we're working under right now for this project was $70-some-odd thousand?
I think it was about, $75,000. We had $200,000 for the DPW.
That's next one,
We
okay.
have, we're waiting for funds to be released, $50,000 for cybersecurity, $5,000 for tablets. We got 24 or so $1,000 for the basketball hoops and recreation. And they're still waiting to re-release the about $17,000 for a study of the town common.
Okay, what about the scanning of the documents to get them elected?
That was an IT Community Compact Cabinet grant, so I don't know if they would link that one directly, but that one was about $117,000.
Okay, so just in round numbers, because we don't have everything detailed out like you're going to have at some point as we continue this for the hearing, but just in the last 15 or 18 months, you have picked up in excess of $300,000 worth of earmarks
Easily.
that have saved the town the dollars that we would have to expend to take on these projects that are necessary on a yearly basis or a 5-year basis. I mean, the last time these rules and regs for planning and zoning were
I would also, that's something I think people would want to consider. Anything else to talk about?
Did you get the zoning overlay? Did Jane get it to you?
Yeah.
Yep, I have already had it up, but I can put it up again, Neil.
Yeah.
No, I just must nod it off.
I think what's also important to note is what 3A does not do. You know, we had talked about it does not require any production of housing, just the zoning. It does not supersede any wetlands or Title V.
Yep.
It does not supersede any historic districts. I think that's important, especially for a town like Paxton that does have, a fairly significant amount of water resources, as well as a historic district. And even though we have not selected any of the areas, any of the potential overlay areas to be in the historic district, I just think it's important to know that the state was thoughtful
Right.
in how they developed the regulation.
Yeah, and that gets to the point about the excluded land. I mean, the state doesn't want us building multifamily housing on top of wetlands that are then going to erode and cause problems for residents. It doesn't supersede any of these sort of core, environmental and safety protections that, we all appreciate and benefit from.
All right, Gabe, would you just, I'm not sure everybody at home can see that, but what districts do we have on that overlay map right there?
So this overlay map, TA would be another set of overlay districts, in three locations.
Okay, would the business overlay district, would that start, because we're seeking changes in that, so would that have a different color on it, or that, there you go.
Yeah, so
This is the current one,
So
not
for
the
context, most towns have the overlays and the underlying on the same map. Right now, Paxton has
Several pages.
several pages. So this is what I was talking about earlier. We have the underlying zoning. We have, again, we do have another overlay here. We have the watershed protection overlay as
Correct.
well. So in addition to the floodplains. So again, that floodplain protection stuff, the watershed protection stuff would not be superseded by MBTA. You still would have limitations on, if there was overlap, there would still be those same limitations on multifamily development. But this is what I was talking about. You have in red the business district, then you have general residence A, which is denser single family housing with smaller minimum lot sizes. And then you have general residence B, which, in some towns would be called agricultural zoning, agricultural residential, that has larger minimum lot sizes. The houses will be more spread out. I know part of the zoning changes we're looking at is we're expanding the business zoning along 122.
Correct. That was last week's session.
Oh, okay.
So we
Okay.
spent time on that.
Okay.
This is what's presently in place right now.
Right.
Just so people have an understanding of, it's, overlay can be,
What the state requires, they want a certain amount of units at 15 units per acre. Outside of that, the town actually does have quite a bit of flexibility in how they get there. So I know a concern that came up in our meetings. I think the primary concern from a dimensional standpoint. So again, for some background, when you're looking at a zoning bylaw, a core piece of the zoning bylaw is the dimensional standards of the given district. So do you want to pull up, do you have the section 16?
Proposed bylaw,
Yeah,
right there.
yeah. So I don't know if you have the dimensional regulations available.
Are they as part of it?
I think it's page 2.
Yeah, it's probably page 2. Sorry. Yeah, so right here.
there we go.
So this is a pretty typical part of any zoning bylaw. Like I was talking about before, you have that minimum lot size. That's really a core piece of what gives a zoning district its character. You have the lot frontage, which is sort of along the road of the parcel, the width that you were required. So these are minimums. You're looking at minimum 80,000 square feet, which is half stories. The other key concern was fire truck access. If we're building multifamily housing, we want to make sure that, God forbid there's a fire, the fire truck can get the ladder up and make sure people are safe. So having that height limit of 35 feet was something we really focused on. And I think if you're looking at what a multifamily building that could have several units looks like, this is, I think, a pretty reasonable place to be for a town like Paxton.
Did we have discussions about 4 units per structure? Is that where we settled in on, or was it?
I think we agreed. I don't know where we ended up with that. Let me look.
Where's that gonna be, Gabe? Up or down? Cheryl says down. I'm gonna go down.
I don't believe we ended up with that. Yeah, I don't see anything about that.
Local touch as to what the differences may be from the standard model.
Yeah. So yeah, I think the key thing, right, is the dimensional standards, wanting to make sure that that was in line with what the characteristics of the town were. Another thing where towns are given a bit of leeway is how the bylaw interacts with their inclusionary zoning bylaw. So for the purpose of this bylaw, we exempted it from the inclusionary zoning requirements in Paxton. The state allows towns to go, up to certain numbers. We decided that was not, wouldn't really make sense in Paxton. We have off-street parking requirements. We're requiring, in these overlay districts, if you're building multifamily, you're required to have, you can only have up to 1.75 parking spaces per unit, which is, a pretty, I think a solid number, so that you're not incorporating a ton of parking, you're not building a bunch of unused pavement, but, you are allowing parking for these multifamily units. There is this general development standards section of the bylaw. I would say requirements that we have that 30% open space, because a septic is obviously on the surface open space. But there's not a specific, at this point, there's not a specific septic requirement.
Is that something that could be handled at site plan, or should it be to protect the town in the bylaw?
I think that would be something that you would want to handle at site plan.
Okay.
Because I think you're looking at a case-by-case basis.
But doesn't the state trump or surpass whatever the local is? So if they, I want to make sure we have that safety factor built in. So there has to be a reserve parcel on, or a reserve piece of the parcel to make sure that we can accommodate a septic failure.
Okay.
So somehow or other, I thought we had all agreed to that it would be in there somewhere.
Okay. Yeah, we can certainly modify it to try to include that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I think, Gabe, we've talked about affordable, but I think it's important to note that we're talking about capital A affordable, meaning the
Right.
state would provide a subsidy in
Right.
order to lower the rent of these units, and the town would, or a developer would manage those units.
Right.
And there's currently, in the state bylaw, no requirement for the town
Yes.
to make the units capital A affordable.
Mm-hmm.
The town has that ability to offer a certain percentage of them as capital, what the developer puts forward and what the town accepts.
I would say it's what the developer puts forward and what the town accepts. I think, I mean, if we want to include a mix of types of units, I don't think this came up, but we could, I can look into if that's a possibility. But I think, yeah, I'll have to look into that,
Yeah.
but that's a good point.
I think most communities' concern in this is not having new people in the community. I think it's
Right.
the demand on services, including the educational demand on services. And while I think many of us would have wished for a bit of a carrot as well as a stick, and
Yeah.
that the state would offer some additional revenue in terms of how many new students to your school system that you would be accepting, you know, that hasn't happened. It hasn't happened yet, or it just won't happen. But I do think it's something that maybe we should look into. I don't, usually a developer comes forward with, the sort of the best model and mix of units that work for their pro forma, but maybe it's something that the town wants to think about, either a minimum of studio and one bedrooms or a maximum of 3 bedrooms.
Right.
But as long as that's what
The
That's-
size of the septic they put in might dictate the number of bedrooms that they can.
Well, again, that's where I was going with this, because if you have
Yeah.
a studio that's, one bedroom, that's roughly 200 gallons of water per day, but if you put in a 2 or a 3 bedroom, we're
Right.
up to 600 plus gallons per day, and then that makes that system have
yeah.
to be bigger and, okay.
So I do think you could see a scenario, I think, on the developer side where, due to those septic limitations, they're not going to go for a 3-bedroom. Because if they can only fit so much of their septic system, that's sort of a technical limit on what they can do
Right.
within their pro forma.
Okay.
So I think that is like a possibility.
So that could also settle down some discussions about the strains on town services. Okay.
Yeah, because if you're looking at town sewer, I mean,
Well, I was looking more at school.
right. But again, if you had a sewer situation, there's much higher hypothetical limit on the water
Absolutely.
need. Septic, you do have these physical limitations on what that particular parcel can provide for.
Okay.
So I think that could act as a natural.
Deterrent?
I hate to say deterrent, but that's the first word that came to mind.
Yeah,
Okay.
for the lack of a.
Yeah, the bylaw does have a lot of really nice not restrictions, but these the design guidelines for the multifamily housing. And I think that's a really cool opportunity for a town like Paxton that hasn't had a wealth of multifamily housing. You now have on the books a set of design guidelines for these buildings. And that's a real area where the town can assert influence on how these buildings look, make sure that they're modern and in line with what the town wants. We have these open space requirements. We have relatively high lot minimum size. I mean, these are all, I think, for a town like Paxton, fairly desirable things. And I think this goes a long way in sort of giving Paxton a nice template for if you want to expand multifamily housing, if you want to look at other design guidelines for other sorts of projects. This is, the state did provide like pretty thorough design guidelines for these towns, because a lot of the towns adopting this zoning have no history of multifamily housing and there's no document for them to regulate it. So I think that's an exciting opportunity with these model bylaws.
Thank you, Gabe. So with that, let's see if there's any questions. Any questions from the audience? No? Okay. Any questions from anyone at home? Check it again. Okay. I do not see any. To Gabe and Jane for their assistance at getting the responses back out and trying to tackle some of them ourselves where we can. After that point, it will be the special town meeting on November 18th at 7 p.m. So anyone has any questions, again, please reach out. hmonroe@townofpaxton.net is how you can connect with me or send your questions in, and we will get them over. And Neil would like,
No, I just have a comment, Heather.
Okay.
Yeah, the process is winding down, and I think, as you mentioned, those of us that have been here, we're kind of grateful for that. However, I want to make sure that we have as many questions before we go to the hearing with the planning board, so that we can give answers that will help those people decide whether they like this or don't like. And it's not just this section tonight, it's the entire process that we've gone through. So it's very, very important right now. I'm not saying we don't want to have questions at the hearing, but if it's going to require some sort of technical research to get an answer, we can't do it that evening. And that may delay, it would stall the process a little bit before we get to the special town meeting in November. So we have roughly 4 weeks left. Today's the 17th, and we're going to have the special town meeting on the 18th, so there's 30 days. And we want to make sure we can bring this thing to fruition at that point. So if
absolutely.
you're listening at home, please, if you have any concerns, let us know what they are before. Thank you.
All right, with that, thank you very much.